They thought confession was a cleansing act, a ritual of forgiveness. But inside the small wooden box, something listened that was not God. Whispers were recorded, sins cataloged, and voices answered back. The church sealed the records and swore the booth was never used again. But silence cannot hide the truth forever. What they found in the priest's confessional was never meant for human ears. The camera lingers on a dim church aisle. Dust drifts in thin shafts of light. The lens holds, almost motionless, as though the walls themselves are breathing. We are in the place where sins were meant to vanish, but here they were recorded. Confession has always been considered one of the most private acts in Catholic tradition, a sacrament not performed in public, not displayed before the congregation, but whispered between one sinner and one priest, in secrecy, in silence. The ritual is older than many kingdoms. From the earliest centuries of the church, confession began as open acknowledgement of sin before an entire community. But over time, it was deemed too humiliating, too harsh, too prone to scandal. So the act moved inward, from the public square to the shadow of the chapel, from the crowd to the booth. By the 15th century, wooden confessionals had spread across Europe. Tall boxes with partitions and thin screens. A sacred architecture designed not for grandeur, but for separation. One side for the priest, one side for the penitent, a wall between them. But a closeness too, close enough to hear each word of sin, close enough to smell the breath of repentance. The design was always simple. Wooden panels, a lattice screen, a small seat. Inside, the darkness made one feel removed from the world, yet dangerously exposed to God. Every booth carried the same purpose, to hold secrets. And in one parish, far north, where winters gnawed at stone and the air smelled of pine resin, a confessional arrived that did not look like the others. It came by cart, the villagers remembered, drawn by horses along a frozen road. The crate was larger than most, wrapped in canvas stitched with iron clasps. The driver said little. He delivered it at the church steps and left before dawn. The parish had been expecting a replacement confessional. Their old one had rotted in dampness, its panels splitting, its hinges warped. What they received was something altogether different. The priest of the parish, Father Ulrich, was the first to notice. When the men of the village unfastened the crate and peeled away the covering, he felt an unease that he could not name. The wood was darker than oak, though it had not been painted. It seemed aged, though the surface was smooth, the joints intact. And there was a smell, not a polish, not a pine, not decay. Something closer to iron, closer to blood. The booth was heavy, much heavier than it should have been. It took 6 men to drag it into the nave, their hands blistering on the edges. It did not creak when they moved it, nor rattle, nor sway. It stood solid, as though cut from a single trunk of some vast tree. The villagers were impressed. Some said it looked stately, like the confessionals in great cathedrals of the South. But Ulrich said nothing. He only ran his hand along the paneling, and felt grooves beneath his palm. Not scratches, not damage, but marks, as though words had once been carved there and sanded away. The booth was installed at the side of the nave, a tall shape in shadow, waiting for the first penitent. Candles burned near it, but it would seem always darker, as though it absorbed the flame rather than reflecting it. And so the villagers grew curious, for this was to be their new box of secrets. Confession was held that Sunday. The line of parishioners formed as usual, each kneeling in turn, each waiting for their moment in the box. For many, the experience felt the same as before. A whisper, an absolution, a prayer. But a few noticed something strange. The acoustics. The booth carried sound differently. Every syllable seemed sharper, clearer, almost amplified. When a voice trembled, it echoed faintly back, as if spoken twice. One woman, after her confession, told her husband she felt as if someone else were listening. Not Father Ulrich, not anyone she could see, but someone nearer, breathing. Whispers spread through the parish. Most dismissed them. The booth was simply built differently. Perhaps its walls were thinner. Perhaps the angle of its screen allowed sound to travel. There was no reason to imagine more, but unease had already begun. Ulrich, in his private journal, wrote of his first days within the booth. He described the closeness of the wood, the smell, stronger when enclosed, and something else, a feeling when he placed his hand upon the inner panel, as if the wood was warm, as if it retained the heat of those who had pressed against it before. Yet it was newly delivered. No one had used it before that week. He noted, too, the way his own voice seemed altered when speaking absolution. Harsher, not his cadence, not his tone. He wrote, "I sound not myself in the box. I sound like one giving command, not blessing." Still, the confessional was used. Week by week, more and more voices were poured into it. The villagers confessed their quarrels, their small thefts, their desires, their doubts, and always the booth received them. Always it echoed faintly back. It was an old man, a farmer, who first spoke openly what he had heard. He claimed that, as he confessed, there was a pause. He had told Ulrich of a cruel thought he had toward his son, a moment of anger, and in the silence before the priest answered, he swore he heard something else. A breath, then a whisper. It said only one word, his name. The villagers laughed. They said the old man was tired, his ears weak, but he insisted he had not heard Ulrich speak until after that pause. He insisted he had been named. Father Ulrich tried to assure the parish that nothing was wrong, but his own doubts were growing. In his journal, he confesses unease. He wrote, "When they kneel, I hear their words, but I also hear them again, as if they are repeated, only slightly altered." He asked the diocese if a replacement might be provided, but his request went unanswered. The booth remained. The parishioners grew used to it. They laughed at their own nerves. They told themselves the whispers were tricks of echo, but there were moments no one could explain. A girl of 12 went into box. Trembling, she confessed stealing apples from her neighbor's tree, and when she emerged, she was pale. She said the priest had told her the exact number of apples she had taken, but Father Ulrich swore he had not. He said she had given the number herself. The girl insisted she had not. One evening, Ulrich remained in the church long after dark. He sat in the pews, staring at the booth. The candles had burned low, and the shadows seemed thicker around it. He wrote, "It does not sit as furniture should. It sits as presence, as if it were not built but grown here." And then he wrote of a sound, a faint knocking from within, 3 taps, slow, deliberate, no one inside, no one near, but he told no one, not yet. The villagers continued to kneel inside. Their sins continued to be whispered into its wood, and Ulrich continued to listen, all the while feeling less and less certain that he was the only one who did. It is here at the beginning that the story turns, for what entered that box was never meant to leave it, and what listened in return was never meant to forgive. And that was only the first week. The nave is still. Light falls in narrow streams through stained glass, broken into red, gold, and green. The camera drifts closer, slow, toward the tall wooden booth standing against the wall. Its doors are closed, but it feels as if something waits inside. The parish had grown used to it. The new confessional was no longer a novelty, no longer spoken of with awe. It was simply the place to kneel when the week grew heavy with guilt. And on Sunday they came, old men with cracked hands, young wives with heads covered in wool, children nudged forward by parents who told them it was time. Each one carried something they wanted lifted from them, and the booth seemed ready to receive it. At first, everything was familiar. Father Ulrich sat inside, listening. The voices were hushed, timid, barely above breath. The words spilled, then faded into silence. Absolution was given. Prayers were assigned. The cycle continued. It should have ended there. But something wasn't right. The first to notice was a baker's son, 17 years old. He had come to confess a fight with his brother, a strike delivered in anger. As he spoke, he faltered, and in the pause, he swore he heard something move. A breath, sharp, close. When Father Ulrich spoke again, it was ordinary, measured, kind. But the boy could not forget that sound. He left the booth pale, glancing back at the door as if someone else had been seated inside. Others followed. A woman confessed envy of her neighbor's land. She said later that she felt a second voice behind the priests, faint, almost overlapping, like an echo or an answer delayed. When she told her husband, he told her it was her nerves. She agreed, but her hands would not stop trembling. One by one, the parishioners began to whisper of it, a hesitation before Ulrich's words, a breath too near, sometimes even a murmur, as though something repeated the sins back before absolution was given. Most laughed it away. They told themselves it was the echo of the wood, the strange acoustics of a booth built differently from their old one. What else could it be? But unease began to settle. Father Ulrich wrote in his journal, "They grow restless. They tell me I wait too long before speaking. But I do not. I speak at once. Still they insist. They say they hear me twice." He did not know how to answer them. The booth filled with voices. The villagers brought their small trespasses, their doubts, their cruelties. But more and more, they emerged shaken. A woman dropped her rosary as she left, unable to close her fingers. A boy refused to kneel at Mass, muttering that the box had spoken his name. And one man would not return at all. Her name was Margaretti. She was 32, a widow with 2 small children. And she was the one who spoke most clearly of what she had heard. She told the priest's housekeeper that she had gone in trembling, as always, that she had knelt and whispered her sins. But the reply she heard was not Father Ulrich's. The cadence was wrong, the tone unfamiliar. She swore the voice that answered her belonged not to a man at all. When Ulrich heard this, he denied it. He said she was mistaken, that no one else had been there, that she had heard him and only him. But she refused. She swore before God that the voice was different, and she would not enter the booth again. The others dismissed her. They said grief had unsettled her mind, that she was lonely, that she imagined things. But her children repeated the story. They said their mother cried when she prayed at night, that she begged God not to make her go back. Still, the booth was used. It was Sunday duty. It was tradition, and the parish could not abandon it. But they began to notice more. The pauses before Ulrich spoke. The slight delay, as though someone else were whispering first. The way their confession seemed repeated back to them. Not in full, not exact, but enough to freeze their blood. A farmer remembered confessing his bitterness toward his neighbor. When he finished, he heard the same words again. Not from Ulrich, not from himself. A whisper, softer, from the wood. He left shaking. But when he told his wife, she laughed and said he was tired. Whispers spread. Some said the booth was blessed too deeply. Others said it was cursed. Most tried not to think of it. But each week, more and more returned pale, uncertain, unable to explain what they had heard. And Ulrich himself began to dread it. He sat in the booth longer than he should. Even after confessions ended, he lingered, listening, straining, and he heard it too, a sound that did not belong to him, a breath not his own. He wrote, "When they kneel, I hear them speak, but before I answer, the box itself seems to speak also, as if it cannot help but repeat, and sometimes it is faster than me." One night, he left the booth and pressed his ear against the wood. There was nothing, only silence, but when he pulled away, he felt the heat of the panel, warm, as though another body had been pressed there. The villagers did not know this. They only knew their unease. The whispers became rumor. Rumor became fear. And Margaretti's voice carried above them all. She swore, again and again, that she had confessed not to a man, that the voice that answered was something else. They called her hysterical. They called her mad. But when she stopped attending Mass, they noticed. When she refused to let her children approach the booth, they whispered. And when she began telling neighbors to stay away from it, they turned from her. But Ulrich could not. Her words echoed his own doubts too clearly. He began to wonder if she was right, if he had not been the only one answering inside that wooden box. And it was here that the first real fear began, not among the villagers, not even among the children, but within the priest himself, because he could no longer say with certainty that the voice they heard was his. The church is still, the nave stretches into shadow, and the camera drifts slowly toward the confessional. It's what absorbs the light, as though it does not want to be seen. By now, Father Matthias Ulrich had grown uneasy. He had tried to dismiss the villagers' whispers. He had tried to tell himself it was nerves or echo or imagination, but the booth was changing him too. Each time he stepped inside, he felt it, not a thought, not a fear, a presence. In his journal, the entries became shorter, less orderly, written in haste, as though he could not bear to dwell on the words. "It listens," he wrote. "Even when no one speaks, it listens." At first, he thought it was exhaustion. The parish was small, but the work was endless. Mass, confession, baptisms, funerals. And in winter, when the roads froze, he was the only priest within miles. Surely weariness explained it, but something wasn't right. He noticed that during absolution, he would lift his hand to speak the words of forgiveness, and in the pause, he felt them spoken already. Not aloud, not in his own mind, but somewhere between the two, as though the booth itself anticipated him. The parishioners left unsettled, but he left worse, because he could no longer trust the sound of his own voice. He began testing it. Subtle, careful tests. When a penitent whispered their sins, he would delay his answer. He would wait, count slowly to 3. And sometimes they flinched before he spoke, as though something else had filled the silence. One night, he returned to the church after Vespers. The nave was empty, the candles low. He sat inside the booth alone. No voices, no prayers, just the sound of his own breath in the dark. He whispered a word into the wood, his own name, and in the stillness that followed, he heard it again, fainter, repeating. He pushed open the door and staggered out, heart hammering. His journal entry that night was longer. "It is not echo. I know echo." The booth answers back, not only to them, to me as well. The following Sunday, he stumbled during confession. A woman confessed a lie she had told her husband. Matthias waited to answer, but before he could speak, the woman recoiled. She cried out, saying she had been answered already, that the voice came through the screen too soon, too close. Ulrich denied it. He swore he had said nothing, but the woman fled the church in tears. The parishioners began to watch him differently, not with reverence, but suspicion. They wondered if their priest was faltering, if his words could still be trusted. And in his journal, Matthias confessed the same fear. "It makes me doubt myself. When I speak, I no longer know if the words are mine. When they tremble, I no longer know what they hear. I feel as though I am only repeating what has already been said." The days grew colder. The wind rattled the stained glass, and still the booth waited, dark, silent, listening. Matthias wrote to his superiors. His letter was formal, measured. He explained that the booth unsettled the parish, that its presence disrupted the sacrament, that it should be removed. He sealed the letter with wax and sent it south with a courier. Weeks passed. No reply. The villagers grew restless. Some refused confession altogether. Others came only once, then never returned. And those who still entered did so trembling, clutching their rosaries until their knuckles went white. Yet the booth remained, immovable, as though it had always been there. Matthias wrote again. This time his words were sharper, less restrained. "It is not fit for holy use. There is corruption in it. I feel another presence. Remove it. I cannot hear them without hearing it also." Again no reply, only silence. He began to dream of it. The narrow seat, the wooden lattice, the faint smell of iron. In his dreams, he sat inside, waiting, and always the door creaked open. But no one entered. Still, a voice would whisper through the screen, low, urgent, repeating his own words back to him. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced the booth had followed him into his sleep. By Advent, he could no longer disguise his unease. His sermons grew shorter, his eyes hollow. Parishioners whispered that Father Matthias had grown sick, that he looked thinner, that he had aged 10 years in a single season. He avoided the booth except on Sundays when duty demanded it. Even then, he lingered outside until the last possible moment. Standing in the nave, staring at it as though it stared back, he tried holy water. He sprinkled the panels, the floor, the seat. He murmured prayers as he did, watching the droplets run down the dark wood. They left no mark, no trace, as though the surface absorbed them entirely. In his journal he wrote, "They will not remove it. They will not answer me. I am alone in this. I know what I feel when I sit inside. It is not imagination. It is not echo. There is another presence with me." The booth began to intrude on his thoughts outside confession. When he walked through the village, he felt watched. When he prayed at night, he felt listened to. He feared his own silence, because in silence, the presence seemed nearest. And then came the breaking point. A child, no more than 8, entered the booth one Sunday. She confessed to stealing a ribbon from her sister. Matthias waited to respond, but the girl's eyes widened through the lattice. She whispered, "You already said it." Matthias froze. He had not spoken, but the girl insisted. She swore he had answered before she finished. She fled the booth weeping, refusing to return, and Ulrich was left alone inside, shaking. That night, he wrote the longest entry of all. The ink was smudged, the hand unsteady. "I fear the booth is not merely listening. I fear it repeats. I fear it speaks. And when it does, it uses my own voice. I cannot tell where I end and it begins. If they hear me twice, then one of those voices is not mine, and I do not know which." He sealed the journal and placed it beneath his bed. Then he knelt to pray, but his lips would not move. It felt as though the words had already been spoken. The church never replied to his letters. No courier returned. No answer was sent. The booth remained, silent, watching, and Father Matthias began to wonder if his doubt was no longer doubt at all, but recognition, because he was certain now of one thing. When he entered the box, he was not alone. The camera drifts slowly, through the nave, across the pews, past flickering votive candles that gutter with each stray breath of wind. It stops at the booth. That dark, silent box. Its door closed, its lattice unmoving. And yet, inside, voices were waiting. It began with the children. In every parish, catechism required them to confess, to learn early the ritual of admission, of sin spoken aloud and of forgiveness received. It was part of the rhythm of faith, a lesson as important as the prayers they were made to memorize. Here, in this parish, parents were proud to see their sons and daughters take their place, to kneel, to whisper, to be seen by God. But this was not like the others. The first boy to step inside was no more than 8, thin-shouldered, his wool jacket too big for him, handed down from his older brother. He clutched a rosary. His lips were trembling. He had practiced a confession the night before. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The words came, halting, stiff, but then he stopped, because from the other side of the lattice, there came a sound. It was not the scrape of a chair, not the shifting weight of a priest. It was the sound of someone whispering his name. He froze. His small hands tightened around the beads. But the priest had not spoken yet. And when the priest finally did, the words came too late. But something wasn't right. The boy stumbled through the prayer. He hurried. He rushed. He wanted only to be out. When the door opened, he left with tears in his eyes. He would not tell his parents what he'd heard, but others followed. One by one, the children were guided to box. One by one, they sat in that dim space, the scent of old wood and wax pressing in. And each time, there was something before the priest. A faint pause, a breath, sometimes a word, sometimes nothing but a low murmur. And always, it felt as though the confessional already knew. A girl of 10 entered on a damp autumn morning. She carried with her the guilt of small lies, stealing fruit, speaking back to her mother. But when she sat down, the whisper that came through the grill did not ask what she had done. It named her, and it named the thing she had not yet spoken aloud. Her hands shook, And when Father Matthias finally spoke, his voice sounded almost like an echo of what she had just heard. And that's when she realized it. She was not confessing to a man. She was confessing to something else. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread quietly. Mothers whispered among themselves that their children were restless, that they dreamed of voices in the night, that they would not pass the churchyard alone. One boy refused outright to return. He hid behind his home each Sunday, feigning illness, sobbing when forced to dress. And still, no one could give an answer that made sense. Father Matthias wrote in his journal that the children seemed altered, that they carried with them not the relief of forgiveness, but the weight of something heavier, something unshaken, something unrelieved. It was as though their sins were not taken, but bound. And in the silence of his own chamber, he wondered, bound where the parishioners, when they spoke of it all, spoke in half phrases, in unfinished thoughts, that the booth listened to closely, that it did not absolve but collected, that it remembered. And soon, a darker idea began to take hold. If sins could be stored, what did the box hold now? The children would not go near it. The women crossed themselves as they passed. And even the men, who prided themselves on being strong in faith, admitted unease in its shadow. Yet the booth remained. The church did not answer Father Matthias' requests. And each Sunday, as the bell rang and the parish filled, the confessional stood waiting, silent, patient, and inside, something seemed to breathe. The boy who had first entered never forgot. He would grow to adulthood, carrying the echo of that whispered name. But in that year, in that parish, no one could have guessed how deep the shadow of that booth would grow. The camera drifts closer to the lattice, the wood, worn smooth by the press of countless hands. The narrow slits dark, unyielding, and somewhere just beneath the hush, there's a sound like a child's voice, calling, waiting, and the chapter ends not with relief, but with a lingering question. If confession is meant to cleanse, what happens when the act itself becomes a weight? What happens when the voice that answers is not the priest at all? The silence of the box deepens, and the door stays closed, because no child dares open again. The camera drifts slowly over the quiet rooftops of a town in late autumn, chimneys cold, windows drawn shut, and in the distance, the bell tower of St. Mary's Cathedral, rising like a monument against the pale sky. The lens lowers, street by street, until it finds the body. She was a parishioner, an older woman, known for her devotion, always the first to arrive at Mass, the last to leave after her prayers, her hands forever knotted around a rosary. Now she lay on the flagstones of the churchyard, her back against the wall, her eyes half open to the gray morning. Her fingers were locked, white-knuckled, still clutching the beads, and her lips, they were cracked, dry, split at the corners, as though she had been whispering long after her breath had gone. The neighbors gathered slowly, in twos, in threes, peering at her from a distance. None dared to move her. They said the rosary was warm, though the body was cold, and someone swore they heard a murmur, a faint sound of prayer, still clinging to the air around her mouth. But something wasn't right. Inside the church, Father Matthias was told. He came quickly, his cassock dragging over the stone, his eyes tired. He had seen death before, but not like this, not with that expression, because her face did not hold peace. It held strain, a terrible strain, as though she had spoken without rest for hours, for days, for longer than a human throat could allow. He knelt. He pressed a crucifix to her forehead, but the body did not change. And when he tried to pry her fingers from the beads, he could not. The rosary was bound in her grasp, tight as iron. That morning, no Mass was held. The cathedral doors stayed closed, but whispers spread to the town that she had gone into the booth the night before, that she had confessed, and never truly left it behind. One neighbor swore she had seen her return again and again, at dusk, at midnight, entering the confessional in silence, and leaving only after the bells. Others said they heard her voice carried through the walls, whispering, always whispering, and when the priest examined the booth, the seat was still warm, The air still smelled of her breath. The community began to suspect. For months they had felt the unease. The children first, then their parents. The sense that the confessional did not cleanse, but held on. Now a woman was dead, and her body told them what they feared most, that the booth did not forgive. It consumed. Father Matthias wrote in his journal that night, "I cannot permit this to continue. If the box harbors something unclean, then it must be met with prayer, with force, with ritual." He prepared himself. Holy water, crucifix, stole, the Roman ritual, open to the rite of exorcism. He would go inside the confessional, and he would drive out whatever had taken root. The parish gathered in silence as he began. They stood at the edge of the nave, huddled together like sheep, watching as their priest entered the booth, carrying only his voice and his faith. He sat, he closed the door, and in the dimness, he opened his book. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The words echoed strangely, not outward, not into the chamber, but back, as though the booth itself spoke with him. And that's when he heard it, a second voice. It rose after each prayer, thin, mocking, a mirror of his words, twisted by delay, when he said, "Deliver us from evil." The echo came, "Deliver us to evil," when he cried, "Cast out the unclean spirit." The booth whispered back, "Cast out the clean." The witnesses outside grew pale. They could hear it too, the overlapping voices. The chant answered. Some pressed their hands to their ears. Others fled the nave entirely, but the priest remained. His words grew louder. His voice broke. Holy water sprayed against the walls, dripping down the dark like sweat. He pressed the crucifix to the lattice, and the lattice burned cold. He cried out, "Begone!" And the confessional answered, "Begone." It was not a prayer. It was a dismissal, as though the booth itself was commanding him to leave. His voice faltered. The strength left him, and for the first time in his ministry, Father Matthias felt the words of the church. Empty, the ritual failed. The air grew still, and in that silence he knew the confessional had not been cleansed. It had been fed. When he emerged, the parishioners saw the defeat on his face. He said nothing. He walked past them, pale, trembling, his stole slipping from his shoulders. And that night, no one approached the church. The body of the woman was buried without procession, and the booth remained where it was, waiting, silent, until the next voice entered. And the chapter closes with a single sound, the faintest of echoes carried to the nave, as though someone were still inside, whispering, always whispering. The camera drifts in, slow and deliberate, its lens catching the pale stone of the parish walls. A stillness hangs over the building, like a weight pressing down from the clouds above. For weeks, the townspeople had whispered. For weeks, unease had rippled through families, across pews, through gatherings after Mass. And now the whispers had spread too far. The diocese had been alerted. 3 officials arrived one morning in late November. They did not announce themselves with ceremony. They came in dark cars, their coats buttoned high, their collars stiff with cold, and they carried the kind of briefcases that seemed less suited to faith and more suited to law. At first glance, they looked like any men of the church. Black attire, silver pins glinting faintly at the chest. But the townspeople noticed something colder in their posture, something administrative, something that looked more like enforcement than ministry. Inside the rectory, Father Matthias was made to sit before them. The old oak table between them stretched wide, but the priest still felt cornered. The men listened with professional silence as he spoke. He explained the unease, the booth, the voices children claimed to hear, the strange death of the parishioner, the endless whispering that seemed to coil around his own ears each night. He confessed his fear of the confessional itself, that it no longer seemed to serve the purpose of mercy, that instead it seemed to trap something he could not name. But when he finished speaking, the men did not respond with comfort. They responded with a phrase he would never forget. "This is folk hysteria, Father, nothing more." The words hung in the room, clinical, dismissive, irrefutable. But something wasn't right, because Father Matthias could see it in their eyes. The faint tightening of the jaw, the darting hesitation before they spoke. The smallest betrayals of their expression suggested they had heard of such things before, or worse, seen them. Yet the official line was already chosen. There would be no acknowledgement of something wrong, no removal of the booth, no warning to the faithful. Instead, there would be silence. The officials drafted their report within the hour. They used words like baseless and unsubstantiated. They sealed their statements with wax and filed them as if the matter were already closed. By evening, the decree was read aloud to the parish council. The confessional would remain. Mass would continue as before. The priest was ordered not to disturb the peace with unhelpful speculation. The air in the room shifted. For some, relief washed over them. The fear had been inconvenient. Unspoken doubts about their own faith had been gnawing at them, and the declaration allowed them to dismiss it all. But for others, the decision felt like betrayal. Parents exchanged glances. They remembered their children's trembling voices, their refusal to kneel before the booth. They remembered the parishioner's body, still clutching the rosary, lips cracked and raw. And yet, to challenge the diocese was unthinkable, so they stayed silent. Father Matthias, however, did not. That night, he sat in his study long past midnight, his journal open, the candle burning low. His pen moved slowly across the page as he recorded the words he dared not speak aloud. They will not hear me. They will not listen. They think I exaggerate. But I know what I feel each time I enter that booth. I am not alone. The confessions do not leave it. They remain, echoing in its wood, trapped in its silence. I fear the booth no longer absolves sins. It binds them. The pen trailed off, the ink blotting like a spreading bruise across the page. And still, he wrote one more line. I am certain now that the church fears something more than the truth. Days passed. The officials left, their cars fading down the long road out of town, their breath leaving white trails in the frozen air. And in their absence, life resumed. At least it pretended to. Parishioners came to Mass. Children were ushered once again toward confession. The booth's curtain drew back, and the murmurs of sin spilled once again into the air. But something had changed. The people did not speak of their fears openly, but the silence was heavier than before. Eyes lingered longer on the booth. Hands trembled more as they made the sign of the cross. Parents clasped their children's shoulders with an almost desperate grip. And Father Matthias, he obeyed. He heard confessions again. He recited the words. He gave the absolutions. But he no longer believed them, because each time he sat in that narrow space, the air felt thicker. Each time he heard a voice confess, he also heard something else. The faintest suggestion of a whisper that did not belong to the penitent, a breath that seemed to answer them. He told no one. The officials had made it clear what would happen if he spoke further. His role was no longer to protect his flock, but to preserve silence. And yet, one evening, after hearing confession of a young boy, Matthias lingered in the booth. The boy had left. The church was empty, but Matthias remained seated, his hands pressed against the polished wood. And then he heard it, a voice, whispered, faint but unmistakable. It repeated the boy's sin, word for word, like an echo that refused to fade. His breath caught. He stared at the lattice, and then the voice shifted. It spoke his own name, Matthias. The priest stumbled back, nearly tearing the curtain from its rail. The whisper died instantly, as though nothing had been there at all. That night, he did not sleep. In the morning, he prepared a letter, not to the diocese, not to his parish, but to an old seminary friend, one of the few men he still trusted. In it, he described everything: the booth, the voices, the silence of the officials. But the letter was never sent. He folded it, sealed it, and placed it in the drawer beneath his journal. Perhaps part of him already knew that some truths were not allowed to leave the walls of that church. Weeks later, the diocese sent word again. The documents from their earlier visit had been sealed permanently. They would not be accessible to the parish. They would not be recorded in open archives. It was as if the visit had never occurred. The booth remained. The mass continued. The whispers deepened. And Father Matthias began to realize something chilling. The church did not dismiss his warnings out of disbelief. They dismissed them because they already knew, because acknowledging them would mean admitting how long such shadows had lingered in their halls. The realization hollowed him. Faith had once been his anchor. Now it felt like a chain. The parishioners saw the change in him. His sermons grew shorter, his voice thinner. The warmth that once flowed from him seemed drained, as though the words he spoke no longer reached his own heart. And though they did not speak of it, they noticed something else. He no longer looked at the booth when he passed it. His eyes slid away, as if to acknowledge it was to give it more strength. But it was already too late, because the silence of the officials had given it permission to remain, permission to grow, and permission to claim whatever it wished. The church had intervened, and in doing so, they had ensured that nothing would ever be the same again. The camera holds still, the parish doors closed, the snow drifting softly against the stone, and inside the booth waits, silent, listening. The chapel sat heavy in the night, its stones darkened by age, its windows holding faint reflections of the street lamps outside. Inside, the air was still like a room waiting to exhale. Father Matthias had stopped trusting silence. It had betrayed him too many times. So he began to trap it in a small locked drawer beneath his desk. He kept a collection of wax cylinders, old devices, fragile, meant for dictation and sermons. But now, they had another purpose. Each one bore a date, each one a name. Children, parishioners, the faithful who had stepped inside the booth. He told no one, not even his assistant, not even the sacristan who often lingered too long in the vestry, because Father Matthias had begun to suspect that what entered the booth was not always what came out. The first recording was unremarkable. A young girl reciting the prayers she had been taught. Her voice trembled, but it was human. It was hers. But on the second cylinder, something else had pressed itself into the grooves. A whisper that did not belong. Low, layered, as if spoken from beneath stone. At first, he thought it was the hiss of the machine, an imperfection in the needle, but the words carried shape, and then they carried names. But something wasn't right. Late at night, he would place the cylinder back on the machine. He would sit at his desk, lamp low, and let the voice unspool again. The girl's breathy confession, the pause, and then, just beneath her voice, another speaking in tandem. Two voices, saying the same words, but one was younger, the other older, too old. Matthias found his hands trembling as he listened, because it did not sound like echo. It sounded like mimicry, and that's when he heard it. The voice began calling his own name, not hers, his. He took the needle away sharply, scratching the surface. He could not bear to hear more, yet he could not destroy it either. By the third week, there were 6 cylinders. By the second month, there were more than 20, each one a confession, each one laced with something that had no right to be there. The parishioners never knew. They left the booth believing they had been absolved, believing the weight of their sins had been lifted. But Matthias could no longer meet their eyes, because he knew what waited behind their voices. The cylinders grew darker, the whispers louder. Sometimes they did not even wait for the penitent to finish. They spoke over them, dragging words into strange shapes, foreign tongues, but not of any land Matthias recognized. He had studied Latin, Greek, Hebrew, but these sounds, these syllables, did not belong to Scripture. They belonged to something else. Matthias began to lock his study at night. He told the sacristan not to enter. He told the parish that repairs were underway, but the booth remained open. The diocese had ordered it. The people kept using it. So the cylinders kept multiplying. One evening, after Vespers, he listened again. This time the machine sputtered as the wax turned. The sound cracked, sharp as bone snapping in the dark. He leaned close, straining to hear the words. The parishioner's voice was a man's, old, confessing anger, confessing envy, but beneath it, faint at first, came the whispers again. layered this time, not one voice, but many, a dozen, 2 dozen, all speaking at once. And then they laughed, not loud, not joyous, but thin, mocking, as if the booth itself was amused. Matthias tore the needle away. His hands shook. He pressed his palms to his ears. But the laughter stayed with him. It followed him down the corridor. It followed him into sleep. The next morning, his assistant found him in the pews, eyes red, muttering to himself. The assistant asked what had happened. Matthias only said, "Do not enter the booth." But the parish still came. They still knelt. They still confessed. And the cylinders piled higher. By autumn, Matthias had filled a locked chest, each one carefully wrapped, labeled, sealed with wax, as if sealing the voices would silence them. But silence never came. One night, a storm broke over the town. Rain battered the windows. The wind pressed against the chapel doors. Matthias sat alone, the lamp guttering. He put on one last recording. He shouldn't have, but he did. The cylinder turned. The penitent's voice was faint, almost gone, and beneath it, there was again that strange tongue, that chorus of whispers. He leaned closer. The lamp flickered. The sound filled the study. And for the first time, the voices stopped speaking over the penitent. They spoke directly, not to the booth, not to the penitent, to him. They spoke his name. He staggered back, knocking the lamp. The flame flared, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. But the cylinder kept turning, and the voices kept speaking. He reached out blindly, hands scrabbling at the machine. He pulled the needle away, but the voices did not stop. They spilled from the grooves as if the wax itself bled sound. He slammed the chest shut. He locked it. He prayed until dawn. But something wasn't right, because even when the machine was silent, even when the cylinders were sealed away, he could still hear them, whispering at the edges of his thoughts, repeating his own confessions back to him, and mocking. When the investigators arrived weeks later, they found the chest. They opened it carefully. They catalogued each cylinder, and then they sealed the records. Officially, there was nothing there. No voices, no laughter, no names. The diocese took the cylinders away, locked them in archives, hidden, forgotten. But Father Matthias never forgot, because long after the cylinders were gone, long after the study was emptied and the booth stood unused, he could still hear the grooves, scratching against his skull, repeating, as if the confessions had not ended, as if they never would. And somewhere in the dark, a voice was still laughing. The camera drifts slowly through a dim nave. Dust floats like pale motes in the morning light, spilling through narrow stained glass. The silence is not serene. It is hollow, heavy, as though the church itself has begun to forget the voices it once carried. At first, it was subtle. The pews that had been filled on Sundays now showed small gaps. An empty row here, a missing family there. No one announced they would not return. They simply stopped coming. The sound of the organ played to fewer and fewer ears. The liturgy echoed across the stone, with no one left to answer it back. But something wasn't right. Whispers moved more quickly than sermons. Stories passed from kitchen tables to cobbled streets. Some said they could still hear the murmurs from inside the booth, even when it was closed, even when no one sat within. It was dismissed at first as fear, rural panic, the kind of tales that always shadowed old churches. Yet the deaths were harder to explain. The first body had been written off as coincidence. A parishioner, found with lips cracked and fingers locked around a rosary. But then there was another, and another, each claimed by exhaustion, of a kind no physician could name. Their mouths parched, their eyes hollowed, as if all night they had been whispering, and all of them had confessed shortly before. The parishioners began to notice the pattern. They began to refuse the sacrament. The pews grew emptier still. Father Matthias did what he could. He preached reassurance. He told them faith demanded endurance, that the devil could only work through weakness. But each time he climbed the pulpit, the echo of his own voice unnerved him. He began to sense the same hollowness in the air that gripped his flock. And then he began to sense their eyes. Parishioners who once bowed their heads in reverence now watched him with quiet suspicion. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter as they passed him. Men who once shook his hand after Mass avoided his gaze. They were not merely frightened of the booth. They were frightened of him, because Father Matthias alone still sat inside it. He still listened. He still entered the space the rest of them had abandoned. And that's when he heard it, late one evening. The church nearly empty. He sat alone at the altar, the flicker of a candle barely cutting the dark. He thought he heard a voice behind him. Not loud, not even sharp. A simple murmur, like someone speaking with their mouth pressed close to the wall. When he turned, the nave was empty, but he knew where it had come from. The booth. For weeks, he had resisted admitting it. He had dismissed the rumors as hysteria. He had told himself that sound carried strangely through wood, through vents, through old stone, that no doubt some penitent had whispered so softly it lingered in memory. But now in the silence he knew. The sound was real, and it was still there. He walked toward the booth with a hesitation that betrayed him. He was no longer the confident priest addressing his flock. He was a man approaching something he should not. He opened the door, sat inside, and listened. At first, there was nothing, only the dull hush of his own breath. Then came the faintest murmur. Not words, not language, just a thread of sound, rising and falling. As though many mouths whispered through the wood, his hand trembled as he reached for the crucifix at his chest. He whispered the first line of the creed. His voice felt swallowed before it reached the air. And then, like an answer, the murmurs paused. A silence deeper than silence pressed against his ears. Then came laughter. Not loud, not sharp, just a broken echo of his own words, repeating back at him, but bent, mocking, as if his prayer had been spoken by another voice behind him, but twisted out of shape. He fled the booth that night. The next morning, the rumors were worse. 2 more deaths. One parishioner had collapsed while tending his garden, lips still moving as if in confession. Another was found sitting at her table, head lowered, as though listening to someone who was no longer there. Word spread quickly that the priest himself had been heard whispering into the booth long after the church was locked, that he lingered in the dark too often, that perhaps he had invited something that now lingered with him. Suspicion became accusation. Attendance at Mass collapsed. Whole families withdrew. Doors were locked when he passed by on the road. The confessional, once a place of trust, had become an object of terror, and so the bishop's men ordered it boarded. On a damp afternoon, with only a few witnesses, carpenters nailed heavy planks across the entrance. The hammer blows echoed through the nave like the strikes of a bell. Dust rose with each hit, clouding the dim light. The parishioners thought it would end then, that the fear would die once the booth was sealed. But the silence that followed was worse. For now there was no sound to point to, no shape to blame. Only the knowledge that it had not been destroyed. It had only been hidden. Whispers said it had been moved into the basement, that the bishop's men feared burning it. That fire might release something they could not control. So it was carried below beneath the church and locked away. But still at night, parishioners claimed they heard it. Faint murmurs drifting up through the floorboards, like voices carrying through pipes, or prayers being said by those long dead. And in that silence, Father Matthias vanished. It was sudden. No farewell, Massachusetts. No letter read aloud from the pulpit. Only a single note, found on the altar, his handwriting sharp and hurried. It listened still. Do not answer it. That was all. The pews emptied completely after that. The faithful who remained saw his disappearance not as abandonment, but as proof of what they had feared, that the priest had been consumed by the very thing he had promised to guard them against. The parish collapsed in weeks. The nave, once bright with candles and hymns, darkened into emptiness. Rain leaked through the roof, dripping into the aisles. The air smelled of mildew and old wax, and yet the booth remained, locked in the basement, waiting. Those who dared approach the church swore they still heard it. Not constantly, not always, but often enough that no one lingered long. Some said they caught the faintest sound of wood creaking below. Others swore they heard whispers woven into the wind itself, threading through the cracks in stone. But most disturbing were the children. Drawn near the church by some strange curiosity, they pressed their ears against the doors and swore they heard prayers. Familiar prayers. The voices of their parents, their neighbors, their own families. Spoken as though from a basement. But the names belonged to the dead. And one by one, the families moved away. The parish no longer existed. The mass was abandoned. The hymns forgotten. Only the boarded booth remained, hidden from sight, but not from memory. And the note that said, "It listens still, do not answer it." But even as the church rotted, as ivy swallowed the stone and dust blanketed the pews, no one dared remove it. No one dared unseal the basement, because some doors, once shut, are never meant to open again. And yet, the sound persists. Not always, not loud, but enough. Enough for the few who walk past the ruins at night to hear what they cannot explain. A murmur, a prayer, a voice, too familiar to be ignored. And every year, it grows harder to resist the temptation to answer. The streets around the church look unchanged in photographs from the late 1950s. Cobbled stone, empty storefronts, the same iron railings that had rusted through decades before. But if you look closely at the faces in those photographs, there's a hollowness, a quiet absence just beneath the eyes. The church had spoken, and their word was final. Officials in the diocese issued a statement to the press. There had been no unusual occurrences, no cursed confessional, only baseless rumor, a story inflated by provincial gossip. It was meant to put an end to speculation, but it did not, because by then the survivors had already begun to speak. At first, their voices were hesitant. Fragments of testimony whispered to neighbors, scribbled letters to cousins in distant towns. They feared retribution, yet the silence had become heavier than the risk, and what they revealed was always the same. Not visions, not apparitions, not even miracles, dreams. The parishioners who had entered the booth, or who had lost family inside it, described a peculiar recurrence. Night after night, they found themselves kneeling before the dark panel of the confessional, their bodies bent forward, their heads bowed in submission, and no matter how hard they tried, they could not rise again. One woman, interviewed years later, recalled her nights vividly. She would kneel in her dream, would pressing against her knees. She would see the outline of the booth's door, and she would feel her body straining to stand. But something wasn't right. The harder she pushed, the heavier her body became, until it felt as though invisible hands pressed down on her shoulders. And in that paralysis to sound, breath, not her own, she never told the priest. She never told her children. But the dream followed her for 30 years. Another man left a diary. His handwriting trembled across the page, the entries short clipped. Again last night, one line reads, "I could not get up." On another night, it was waiting. And finally, "I will not confess again." But the church did not preserve these testimonies. What it preserved instead were denials, carefully worded statements, a handful of official letters stamped with wax seals, and files marked confidential, locked away in diocesan archives where ordinary parishioners could not reach. The public story was one of calm. The private story was one of silence. And silence in the church always carries weight. But something wasn't right. In the local archives, researchers decades later would find inconsistencies, reports that contradicted each other, a funeral record without a cause of death, a missing parish ledger, and newspaper clippings that seemed to have been cut away, leaving gaps in the bound volumes. It looked less like error and more like deliberate erasure. And still, the dream spread. It was not only those who had entered the booth who reported them. It was their children, their grandchildren. Generations who had never stepped foot inside the church described the same paralysis at night, the same kneeling, the same failure to rise. One survivor tried to explain it. He believed it was not the booth itself that clung to them, but the act, the posture of confession, the kneeling, the bowing, the silence. Once assumed, it could not be shaken. They had bent the knee before something they did not understand, and in dreams they bent it still. The church rejected this outright. When approached by journalists years later, officials reiterated there was no curse booth, there was no phenomenon, there was only rumor, a trick of memory, a product of hysteria. And yet, the same officials admitted, in private correspondence, that parish attendance had collapsed, that priests refused to serve at the parish, that the confessional itself had been boarded over. And that's when the questions began to sharpen. Because if nothing had happened, why seal the booth? Why suppress the documents? Why silence the survivors? Researchers attempting to access the diocesan archives were turned away. Pastoral sensitivity, the curators explained, there is nothing there of use to the public. But a librarian at the local seminary hinted otherwise. She remembered, as a student, being warned never to ask about the parish, never to look into the records, because certain files had been transferred there temporarily, and then removed. But where were they taken? And why did no one admit to it? The survivors, meanwhile, were left with their dreams. The testimonies grew darker with time. One man described hearing words whispered through the screen, words he did not recognize. Another swore he felt someone breathing against his ear, but when he woke, there was only silence, and yet his body remained locked to the floor. And that's when he heard it, a knock, 3 short taps against wood. In his dream, the booth door trembled. He never slept again. By the early 1960s, the parish was abandoned. The doors of the church remained open, but the pews stayed empty. Grass grew through the cracks in the stone steps. Children refused to play near its walls. And even passing strangers, travelers who had no connection to the place, reported a peculiar sensation as they walked by, an inexplicable urge to lower their heads. The denial had been issued. The documents had been sealed. The booth had been locked away, but the posture remained. A bending of the body, a weight pressing downward, an unfinished act of submission. In time, the stories drifted into rumor. Rumor faded into folklore, and folklore into silence. But silence is never empty, because in silence, something waits. And according to the last letter left by one survivor, it is still listening, even now. And so the chapter closes not with resolution, but with the echo of unfinished prayers, whispered not in churches, not in confessions, but in dreams, where the kneeling never ends. The camera moves slowly. Dust hangs in the air like breath that refuses to leave. A wooden door, swollen with rot, gives under pressure of a crowbar. Light pierces the black. The explorers don't speak. Their cameras do. Their small beams search the ruins of St. Agnes Parish like fingers tracing scars. The church has been abandoned for decades. Yet inside, it feels less abandoned. But something wasn't right. They expected collapse. Graffiti. Ash. But the structure was still intact, holding itself upright with a strange defiance, as though it refused to surrender to time. The pews sat in rows, bowed with mildew. The altar cloth had rotted to threads. Statues of saints had been toppled, their faces broken, their eyes left staring into the dust. And then they saw it, the confessional booth, still standing, the wood warped and splintered, but whole, sealed shut as though still waiting. They circled it, each of them quieter now, the kind of silence that isn't respect. It's fear. One leaned closer. His light caught on scratches along the outer paneling. At first, they looked like accidents, marks of age. But as the lens adjusted, as the focus narrowed, letters appeared. Names. Not a handful, not dozens, hundreds. The walls were filled with them, carved into the wood, layered over each other, some deep, some shallow, some careful, as though written with patience, others frantic, gouging like someone was trying to claw their way into memory. And the names did not match. The parish had never held this many souls, never housed this many voices, but the booth bore them, all the same. One explorer whispered a joke, something about curse wood. No one laughed. The sound died too quickly in the air, and that's when he heard it, the faint creak. The booth had shifted, not much, just enough to remind them that which still bends, still breathes, still listens. They froze. The camera zoomed tighter, framing the slats, the empty lattice where penitent voices once slipped through. It was empty, but it wasn't. They all felt it. The quiet, the thickening weight of air, the unnatural stillness. And one of them, perhaps to break it, perhaps because he couldn't help himself, knelt down. The others told him to get up. He didn't. He said nothing, just remained there in front of the booth, head bowed. His hand trembled, not in reverence, but in restraint, as though something pressed against his chest, holding him in place. When they finally pulled him back, his knees bore dust, perfectly outlined circles, as if he had been kneeling there for hours. He insisted he hadn't meant to kneel, that he didn't even remember lowering himself. He said it felt like answering a question he never heard, but something wasn't right, because later, reviewing the footage, they saw something they hadn't noticed in the moment. The carvings. While they stood inside, circling, recording, the names on the wall had changed. There were more, fresh cuts, and among them their own, written as though someone had known they were coming, written as though the booth had been waiting. They never returned. But others have. Urban explorers, archivists, skeptics, all whisper the same thing. Inside, there is no echo. Sounds die too fast. Breaths vanish too quickly. Time feels altered, stretched thin like paper ready to tear. Some describe dreams after leaving. Dreams of kneeling before the booth, unable to rise. Some awake with their hands pressed in prayer, nails cutting into their palms. Some claim they still hear the lattice creak, but the church remains silent. Officially, the parish is just another ruin, another casualty of disuse and neglect. No unusual activity, no curse, no record. And yet, the booth remains. The names remain. The silence remains. The explorers left with their footage, but none of them have spoken on camera since. None of them have explained the moment the kneeling began. And none of them can answer the only question that matters. Did the booth consume sins? Or did it consume souls? And if it listens still, what happens when it decides to answer? Because silence is never empty. It's waiting. And somewhere in the dust of St. Agnes Parish, the booth still waits, still whole, still sealed, and perhaps still listening. Perhaps confession was never meant to absolve, but to feed. If sin is spoken into darkness, who listens when God does not answer? The church denied the truth, but denial is not silence. The booth waits still, and those who enter may find their sins return to them as voices that do not fade.